Good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Incorporating Health Technology Assessment in Clinical Trials, and my name is Diane and I will be your X-Talks host for today. And today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. And this webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation, and you may do so by using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. And you can find this chat box. It's located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any other assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode, and please note that this event will be recorded and made available for future download. At this point, I would like to thank IDDI, who helped develop the content for this webinar. International Drug Development Institute, or IDDI, is an expert center in biostatistical and integrated e-clinical services for pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies in several disease areas, which includes oncology and ophthalmology. IDDI optimizes the clinical development of drugs, biologics, and devices thanks to proven statistical expertise and operational excellence. Founded in 1991, IDDI has offices in Belgium, Boston, Raleigh, and San Francisco. And now I would like to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. Our first speaker is Dr. Everardo Saad. And Everardo is IDDI's senior medical expert and has over 15 years of experience in medical oncology and clinical trial designs. He graduated in medicine and trained in internal medicine in Sao Paulo, and did his fellowship in medical oncology at the University of Texas and the Cancer Center in Houston. After practicing for several years, he shifted his professional career towards education and research in medical oncology, and has a special interest in clinical trial methodology and assessment of endpoints and the development of novel therapies for cancer patients. And our second speaker for today is Oriana Chani. Oriana holds an MSc in Biomedical Engineering from Politecnico di Milano and postgraduate degree in Healthcare Management and Economics from Bocconi University. She received her PhD from the University of Exeter with a thesis focusing on evaluation of surrogate endpoints in clinical trials and reimbursement policy. Her research interests are centered on the use of evidence synthesis techniques to inform policy decisions and incorporation of economic evidence to inform healthcare policies evaluation. And our third speaker for today is Rod Taylor. Rod was the first Director of Technology Appraisals at the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence in the UK. He graduated at the University of Glasgow, and his postgraduate qualifications include a PhD in clinical sociology and an MSc in medical statistics. His main research interests include clinical design, trial design for complex interventions, the use of surrogate outcomes in clinical trials and reimbursement policy, development and evaluation of secondary prevention and rehabilitation strategies for heart disease, and the evaluation of the comparative effectiveness of medical devices. And now, without further ado, I would like to hand over the mic to our first speaker for today, Everardo. And Everardo, you may begin when you are ready.
Thank you, Diane. Hello, welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for attending this webinar. So my task today is really to make a very short introduction, and this is our view of the problem. For those of you who have attended IDDI webinars before, you may have noticed that we are expanding the scope of our interests. So for the past 25 years, IDDI has focused on the clinical trial methodology that leads to successful drug approval. Now, it's obvious to everyone in this field that there is an increase in costs and an associated decrease in efficiency of the drug development process. And this, of course, has consequences on the prices of products and the reimbursement ability. We can expect a progressive convergence of the clinical trial world and the health economic world. And in fact, we already detect various signals that HTA is becoming an integral component of drug development, and hence our interest in the field. So next slide, please. So on behalf of IDDI, I really want to welcome our two speakers today. We've had the privilege of working with Oriana Ciani and Rod Taylor in previous projects and publications. And these are really outstanding researchers in their field. And we're very happy to have them on board our webinar today. So the way they will work, Rod will come first, and he will explain to us the transition from evidence-based medicine to HTA. And then he will make a very nice overview of health economics in general. In other words, what is an economic evaluation? He will then hand the mic over to Oriana, who will show us a contrast between essentially two models of economic assessment. One is based really on clinical trials and embedded in clinical trials, and the other one is the model-based approach. She will then tell us the influence of HTA in evidence generation. In other words, how can HTA itself impact drug development? And will then present case studies of phase 3 trials that were informed by early dialogue. And she will explain us what the early dialogue really is. And then finally, Rod will come back to the podium and will show us case studies of HTA in clinical trials, particularly examples of situations in which he has been involved as a researcher. So I very much look forward to this webinar and want to now hand it over to Rod.
Thank you very much, Everardo, and I appreciate very much your very generous introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. So what I would like to do in this first part of the presentation is walk you through really an introduction to what health technology assessment, or HTA, is. So in this first slide, I think a very nice way to think about this is to basically ask three questions that we often ask in healthcare. So first of all, can a technology work? And just to be clear, by a technology, I'm talking about a drug, a medical device, a diagnostic, any way in which we might be undertaking the work that we do in healthcare. And of course, the question of can it work is what we often refer to as efficacy. And that's really the springboard of evidence-based medicine. But I guess two important questions that we want to know in addition to that is, does it work in real practice? And I'm going to introduce the term here, effectiveness, or CER, comparative effectiveness research. So does it work compared to what we might otherwise be doing? And then the final question, is it worth it? In other words, if it does offer healthcare benefits, are those benefits worth the additional cost? And that value proposition, or efficiency terminology, as Everardo has called it, is really very much the basis of HTA. I'm just trying to advance the slides, excuse me. Okay, so this next picture that you can hopefully see is just really another diagrammatic way of looking at that. So from slide left to slide right here is basically the concept of how we get evidence, if you like, from the bench to the bedside and to the patient. And of course you'll be very familiar with this concept that on the left of the slide we undertake particular trials that particularly focus on certain types of evidence, particularly in the case of safety and efficacy. And of course, the key issue here is that this is evidence that we've needed to have over a number of years, particularly in the drug space, if we want to market and have our drug licensed. Now, if I advance the slide, where we now live is that is insufficient evidence to receive market access. What we also want, as we've heard, is for a reimbursement or a coverage decision to be made. And here the evidence progresses, and we need a comparative effectiveness. We need to undertake trials of comparative effectiveness. Oriana will go into more detail about the nature of these trials. But also we need to think about incorporating a parallel economic evaluation. Next slide. So in this particular slide, what I guess I'm trying to also show here is that HTA is a very broad church, and is, in addition to the evidence terms I've talked to you about, there are other elements. And quite simply, for the constraints of time today, we're not going to go through all of these, but maybe just to pick up on a couple. Equity. So, it may be that a policymaker might want to not only look at comparative effectiveness and value, but may, for instance, want to consider equality of access to treatment across particular subgroups of patients. Or indeed, we might want to explicitly take into account patients' preferences in those treatments that we might want to make available. So really just to make the point that HTA often does look at other dimensions, but as I say, we're going to focus particularly on comparative effectiveness and economic evaluation today. So basically here's this list in just another way, and hopefully in a second we will show you that what we're going to focus on in the next couple of slides are the costs and economic evaluation. So here's a graphic. I'm sure many of you on the call are familiar with the clinical trial design. So here we've got essentially an allocation to effectively two options: intervention A, or service A, and intervention B. And what economic evaluation is about the comparison of what we would typically do in a trial, which are what we call the consequences here, or outcomes of intervention, but also the comparison of costs. Now, under the heading of costs, of course, there are many types of costs that we can collect within a clinical trial, and this is an attempt to try and summarize those. So basically, in short, there are direct medical costs, the cost of the technology itself, such as the drug, or if it's a medical device, the time of the physician in implanting that device. There may be non-medical costs, such as those incurred by the patient traveling to the centre to have the treatment. But importantly, there are other dimensions of costs, indirect, around productivity, and also what we call intangible costs, which are associated with the costs of, for instance, reduced quality of life. Now, the point I'd like to make here is what's really being highlighted here is that when we do economic evaluations, traditionally, payers are interested in what we call the health system perspective. They're interested in the cost effectiveness and the cost to their budget. However, there is a broader perspective we can take here, the so-called societal perspective, that also captures these other costs. And I guess traditionally, and this is a bit of an oversummary, but if you, for instance, lived in Scandinavia, for instance, their payers have very traditionally been societal in their perspective, whereas in the UK, we've been more healthcare. But the point I want to make is that there is certainly an increasing pressure now for payers to become more societal in their perspective. So for instance, in UK recently, or in the last 5 years, NICE looked at the question of Alzheimer's drugs, and if you think about it, the cost effectiveness of Alzheimer's drugs is not just dependent on the effects on the patient, but also in terms of their carers. That would be an example of what you might call a societal cost. So, point made, we also need to think about this broader perspective, but typically payers think about healthcare costs. So if we are going to do an economic evaluation, how might we do it? Now, this graphic basically kind of gives you an indication that when we do a trial, effectively there's two broad conclusions. So particularly if we do a trial of equivalence or non-inferiority, we can hopefully draw a true statistical conclusion, if it does exist, that treatment A is equal to treatment B. In other words, the outcomes associated with the treatment is the same. And here, really, the analysis is quite simple. If the outcomes, clinical outcomes, are the same, really, it's the difference in costs that matter, and that's as complex as the analysis gets, and we call that cost minimization. However, what we mainly find in trials is that, of course, A is not equal to B. That's why we do trials. Typically, trials have a hypothesis of superiority. So what I'm trying to show you here is basically there are three analytical methods to analyze these kind of results. And the two methods that we tend to focus on typically in healthcare are now summarized in the red box, what we call cost-effectiveness analysis. So what we're typically doing here is using the outcomes in their raw forms. So for instance, as you heard, I do trials in the area of cardiovascular disease. A very common outcome for me here maybe the amount of time spent in hospital. So maybe the difference in cost for a reduction in hospital time would be the metric here. Or secondly, on the right-hand side, the generic measure that we often try and collect in trials, and I'll pick up on this theme in the next couple of slides, is quality of life, or what we call cost-utility analysis. Now, cost-benefit analysis we can do, but just to make the point that that's usually limited to non-healthcare settings such as transport, economics, etc. So, okay, we do these comparisons. How do we make decisions? Well, what I want you to think about is this quadrant. In the quadrant, the origin is what we're currently doing, standard of care. So let's imagine this first scenario. We have a new treatment. It improves what we call QALYs, quality-adjusted life years. We have more years of better quality, and the cost of that treatment is greater. So let me say this again. So we do the experiment. The amount of QALYs we get is less, negative, and the costs are greater. Clearly, that's a dominant decision. We would not want to invest in a treatment that's less effective and more costly. Similarly, if we did the experiment and we find our new treatment is cheaper and more effective, again, that would be a dominant decision. And to be slightly tongue-in-cheek, you don't need a health economist here to make a decision. They are dominant, and that's fine. But of course, the issue we have is that most of the decisions that we have to deal with in healthcare are in what we call the northeast quadrant. In other words, there are additional benefits, more QALYs on the positive scale, but also at additional costs. We need to pay for that additional innovation. And the question is, how do we determine what might be good value for money? And just on the bottom left, I can now introduce something called the ISER, or the incremental cost-effectiveness ratio. And what we're interested in this particular slide is effectively the incremental cost for what is the incremental health gain or QALY gain. And you can see there's two examples here. Lower extra cost, high QALY gain. That would be a low ISER, whereas high extra cost, low QALY would be a high ISER. How do we decide which one of those represents good value? And the answer is we use this thing called a threshold. And in UK, and it's fairly transparent, our cost effectiveness threshold of organisations such as NICE, or the Scottish Medicines Consortium, is about £20,000 to £30,000 per QALY. In other words, if you're the blob with the low extra cost, high QALY, we would fund you, say yes to that, and give you market access. Whereas if you were the blob with the higher extra cost and lower quality, you can see you're above the threshold, and the decision would be a no. Now you might say, well, this is all very well, Rod, but it sounds a bit theoretical. How might I go about doing this? Well, just before I indicate that, here's just an interesting graphic, basically a cartoon showing that clearly your probability of being rejected in terms of a pair is clearly going to be much greater as your cost per quality increases. But the point I want to make is that it's not that line where you just literally go vertical at 30. It's probably more of a sigmoid curve. And the reason I want to emphasize this is that there are other things that payers will take into account, typically when they're making decisions, and we'll just go through what some of those issues are. The first issue may be what we call social value judgments. It may be that certain conditions are given more value than others. So, for instance, in the UK, if you're in what we call an end-of-life situation, we may value that more highly than, for instance, if you have a common disease with a number of years of life still ahead of you. Innovation, I mentioned at the outset that equity is important. And then finally, and this is a very key issue, is the degree of uncertainty around what might be your ISR. And you might, for those of you who are on the call and comfortable with it, what we might call the confidence interval around that ISR. And obviously, the more uncertain we are about that ISR, the less willing we might be to accept a high ISR when we're funding technologies. Okay, so back to this question, how can we go about this practically? So here is an example from my clinical area. So there's two axes. The y-axis you're very used to is the longevity that we would collect in a trial, and then the x-axis is perhaps a little bit less familiar maybe to some of you, which is what we call quality of life or utility, where 0 is effectively death and 1 is perfect health. What I'd like you to do is imagine a situation where a patient is on the dotted line. So if we start at the origin, that patient is currently around about 0.8 on their quality of life scale. And by the way, that's typically the utility in a normal population. And in this case, you can see after approximately 1.5 years, this individual, in this case, has a myocardial infarction or a heart attack. And you can see what happens at that point is that the quality of life drops. They then exist on for another year or so. Unfortunately, they have a second heart attack, etc., etc. And you can see this patient goes on, has their 4th heart attack, and then on the 4th heart attack they die, and they die at about just over 7 years. Now, just sorry, before we leave that slide, if we can go back, let's imagine we introduce an intervention. And the intervention now is a solid line. And can you see what's going to happen with the intervention is, first of all, that the length of life is now got greater. So on average, patients are now living approximately an additional year. But can you see that with this intervention, we also displace the x-axis in a positive upward direction? So how would we calculate the QALYs? Well, effectively, it's just the area under the curve that is effectively the integration of the quality, the number of years of additional life together with the quality of that life. And that's how we do this. And the sorts of instruments we do to collect utility or quality of life that you saw on the x-axis is this sort of measure you have here in front of you. So this is a direct extract of what's called the EuroQAL or EQ5D. This is the EQ5D 3L, I think. So there's 3 responses to each box. The patient fills this out, takes about approximately 10 minutes in our trials, and then we have population weights that we can then apply to this scale, and this gives us the Q in the QALY that then allows us to do that analysis that we saw in the previous slide. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rod. And after this very nice introduction from Rod, we will go back to the first slide, basically, where we described a standard representation of the drug development process with, the sequences of stages going from basic research through preclinical, clinical, and post-marketing development. Now, the number you see in this graph vary according to the specific disease area or the case, but we can agree this is a typical path for most pharmaceutical products. What is usually happening is that after this, the phase 3 explanatory trial drugs get a marketing authorization from the regulatory agency, and after that the HTA evaluation starts. That is the evaluation aimed at informing the reimbursement, the pricing decision, or the market access in many public healthcare systems. This assessment could take a few months and up to years, and most EU member states have delegated these assessments to dedicated agencies. So, for instance, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence in the UK, Autorité de Santé in France, or the Institute for Quality and Efficiency in healthcare in Germany. So compared to licensing agencies that are focused on the risk-benefit profile of the product, the HTA evaluation agencies have different interests and therefore different evidence requirements. The criteria for coverage and reimbursement change across countries. However, it's common to include in this type of evaluation comparative effectiveness evaluation, and demonstrating relative effectiveness in addition to efficacy means providing evidence that the intervention has beneficial health outcomes under real-world conditions, as Rod was saying, and in comparison with the local standard of care. Also according to the specific subgroup population treated in a specific setting. Also, the type of outcomes considered should be final patient-relevant outcomes, that is, outcomes that reflect how patients feel, function, or survive, rather than surrogate or intermediate outcome. And this type of clinical data may go beyond what is required for market authorization, thus creating this evidence gap between the regulatory and the reimbursement submission. Now, if you ask me if this additional evidence generation is worth it, I would say that although the HTA agencies do not have the same legal status as what regulatory bodies are, their relevance is consistently increasing in the pharma company perspective or the medtech company perspective, as market prospects are strongly influenced by the third-party payers' coverage decision. So we said that because of the different remit of the regulatory and reimbursement organization, evidence requirements at the HTA stage may go beyond what is required for instance, a phase 3 trial, and therefore there could be a problem with using standard RCTs for HTA decision making. And these problems are things like, is the trial capturing the real-world effectiveness of the technology? Is the trial population representative of the case mix seen in practice? Have all relevant comparators been included? Are patient-relevant outcomes observed over a reasonable follow-up time? Are costs and resource use measured throughout the study? Rarely phase 3 trials lead to positive answers to all these questions. So there are in general, two ways to address this problem. The first one could be to run a pragmatic trial. Now, pragmatism is more an attitude to trial design rather than a characteristic of the trial itself. And there is more a continuum between explanatory and pragmatic trials, with the pragmatic attitude favoring the design choices that maximize the applicability of the trial's results to the usual care setting and to inform decisions for the health services or health policy where there is a choice to make between two or more alternatives. And this table compares pragmatic and explanatory attitudes according to different dimensions. So pragmatism is associated with answering the "does it work?" question with little selection criteria beyond those applied in practice, with intervention and comparators applied flexibly, and a range of outcomes assessed, including resource use and cost. The second approach to overcome the limitations or the use of RCTs in HTA is to design a model-based cost-effectiveness analysis on top of the phase 3 trial. So for chronic and recurring diseases, decision models are often implementing by using Markov models in which individuals move between health states in discrete time periods, and each state is associated with costs and benefit. The parameters of the models include the probabilities governing the transition between the states, the costs and the benefits that are associated with each state, and the effect of the treatment. Ideally, all available relevant evidence is used to inform these parameters. So this means both experimental studies or population mortality statistics or cohort study. For instance, a Markov model would extrapolate costs and consequences beyond the, let's say, 6 months of the phase 3 trial. Different sources of evidence would be used as input. For instance, a meta-analysis providing relative risks for effectiveness would be applied to underlying common baseline risks derived from, for instance, a large registry that is relevant for a particular situation. And the resource use data could be derived from external sources like observational studies. And also all relevant comparators could be modeled and compared. It is important within this model to take into account the uncertainty around the parameters used in the model, as well as more structural uncertainty. And this is a representation of, again, what is needed to build a decision model. We need to start with a clear idea of how the disease works, health states, and the history progression of the disease, an idea of the treatment and the comparator to include efficacy and effectiveness, as well as the resource use, both direct resource use and productivity losses according to the perspective of our study. As you can see, some of these elements are going to be country-specific, and this will be something to take into account when developing your model. And the results of the model could be used to inform the cost-effectiveness or cost-utility profile of the technology, and after including epidemiologic data around the condition in a specific country, even a budget impact analysis. Now, there are some changes in the institutional landscape around HTA that could inform the drug development process of main pharmaceutical products. And we had this paper out a couple of years ago, which, by the way, is freely available, open access, and even through the handouts of the X-Talks screen. In that paper, we identified 3 activities under the HTA hat that could inform the drug development process, but today we are going to focus on what is called HTA advice and early dialogue. Some reimbursement agencies have set up in recent years what is called scientific advice service to pharmaceutical or medtech companies in order to outline for specific submissions the expected evidence base that could lead to optimal market access outcomes. For instance, the National Institute for Healthcare Excellence in England and Wales was the first agency to set up this service in 2009, and this table compared the NICE experience with the Italian Drug Agency experience. Again, the full table is available in the paper if you can't read this slide. The objective of this service was to help product developers to generate the evidence that is relevant for the reimbursement perspectives. And the content of the advice pertains, for instance, research design considerations such as appropriate comparators, the follow-up duration, or the endpoints to use in the study, how to approach the economic analysis, or how to quantify quality-adjusted life years, for instance. And as the aim is that of making an impact on the strategic development and evidence generation plan, it is recommended to seek this advice when there is still time for the companies to amend the design of their pivotal trials. So, for instance, when the phase 3 study design is ongoing. And this is a service that is available as a fee-for-service consultation to manufacturer. In 2011, HIFA in Italy introduced the same service, which is both a regulatory and HTA service, advice service for companies in Italy. The agency advised on, again, what is the most appropriate comparator, the endpoints used, the acceptability of indirect comparison, and the service fees for this range between 10,000 to up to 40,000 euros. We could also broaden the view and include other countries within Europe which have started similar initiatives, for instance, in Germany or Sweden or in the Netherlands, with different characteristics and features in terms of output, cost, consultation process, and length of the meeting. So we could classify these early dialogue initiatives according to whether a parallel advice is given, which means both regulatory and HTA advice, or according to the geographic scope or the advice, so whether one single country is involved or even more countries at the same time. So the example in Germany, Sweden and Italy are example of parallel advice given within a single country, but for instance UNETA, which is the network of HTA agencies in Europe, has also given the opportunity of HTA advice simultaneously from different agencies across countries. Typically, NICE, HAS, EQUIG, and IFA are involved in releasing this advice. However, European healthcare leaders recently piloted a multi-country, multi-stakeholder early advice forum, which brought developers together with regulators, HTA agencies, payers, clinical experts, patient representatives, and the advice is used to inform a product-specific development plan and also the best approach to demonstrate product value. The pilots of the early advice consultation demonstrated the benefits of this early focused engagement on strategic questions among manufacturers and key European constituencies. The procedure for parallel scientific advice by EMA and HTA bodies is now available for all applicants, and the request can be made directly to the EMA or a specific HTA agencies within Europe. If we look outside Europe, an interesting model that has been developed for aligning the regulatory and reimbursement assessment for medical devices is offered by the MARS Excellence in Clinical Technology Evaluation program, the EXCITE program, currently operating in Ontario. In fact, I have to acknowledge Professor Les Levine for this slide. So in this EXCITE program, device manufacturers can have discussions with both regulators, Health Canada and HTA, Ontario Office for Health Technology Assessment bodies, in order to co-design clinical trials protocols that meet the needs of both the regulator and the HTA bodies. And there is also a network of clinical trials and economic centers that will then help allow the running of the trials. A parallel submission to both decision-making authorities is encouraged and supported, and certainly have the expected net effect of shortening the time to market access for innovative technologies. Now, what are the pros and cons of these activities? While licensing and regulatory post-marketing risk plans are quite homogeneous across regulators in different jurisdictions, so for instance, EMA, FDA, the payers may have different preferences on comparative clinical and economic evidence. Despite the efforts made by organizations such as UNETA to develop common methodologies and practices for HTA across Europe. Hence, companies are offered these opportunities for bipartite or tripartite early dialogue with regulators or regulators and HTA assessors to identify product development plans that satisfy both interlocutors. Companies' representatives who took part in the scientific advice generally agree that the advice given is reasonable and constructive, and some declare to have modified the development program as a result of this consultation. Beyond gaining a reimbursement agency's insight on the strategic development plan and optimizing the evidence generation program accordingly, other more subtle factors for the manufacturer could be an expectation of a later facilitated, maybe technology appraisal, the collection of an informal endorsement on the evidence program, or of the agency perspective on the development program, regardless of the intention to access that specific market. However, this is a new fee-for-service process, and based on current available evidence and experience and poor reporting of it, it's generally difficult to establish whether the modification and which modification on the drug development plan has occurred as a direct contact of this early engagement with the stakeholder. I'm now going on to introduce a case study as an example of a phase 3 trial designed after consultation with 7 HTA agencies. This is the first case study that we chose to present because is a report from one manufacturer seeking this multi-country HTA advice back in 2008 now, and this article is unique in the sense that not many developers would like to share this type of experience, so it was a kind of a pioneering effort. From this table, you'll see that there are some variation in the advice given by the different agencies. However, the similarities far outweigh the differences. To be clear, this was an example on a new oral treatments for patients with chronic plaque psoriasis. This is, for instance, the agreement on different choices of comparator and trial design features, or this second table is the payer's advice from again the 7 different agencies on what is the preferred population for the trial, and what is the subgroup of interest, and again the payer's views on trial duration, maintenance, and type of outcomes to measure. This pilot project demonstrated that a feasible process of early dialogue could be established through this face-to-face meeting with the HTA assessors, and the conclusion was that this process can be worthwhile for all parties and can lead to a common understanding of about the evidence development needed for market access. I'm going to go back to Rod again and leave him the floor now.
Okay, so 1 second trial-based analysis, and then we'll wrap up. So this is an example from a medical device area, and it's really just to illustrate the methodologies that we've been talking about. So I'm not too particular that you understand the technology, but maybe just a quick bit of background here. Spinal cord stimulation is basically a small pacemaker you can subcutaneously implant into the lower back, and then you can stimulate the spinal nerves, and through the gate theory effectively block pain. Now, this is a potentially an expensive technology, and therefore one that payers may want to look at very carefully using the HTA lens to determine whether it's cost-effective and clinically effective. So this is just to share with you how we went about trying to put that evidence together. So this is a trial done by a colleague, Richard North, in the United States, and the next slide will show you that what we did here, sorry, the previous one will show you the analysis we did here. So basically what we did was to compare spinal cord. In this case, the standard of care in the United States was reoperation. Fairly small trial, but this is just to give you a very high level summary of what the total costs per patient were. The main outcome, clinical outcome here, was whether the patient had pain relief or not, defined as success, but we also collected QALYs. So if you look at the third row, you can go back to the cost effectiveness quadrant we looked at earlier. So you can see that the spinal cord stimulation is cheaper than the comparator, but also interestingly, although the increment is small, it does also offer more health benefits. And if you remember, that is therefore a dominant decision. Spinal cord stimulation is less expensive and offers more QALYs against, this case, reoperation. Now, the challenge, going to the next slide, when we do economic evaluations is that the comparator, as Oriana was saying, can vary across jurisdictions. So we also had to undertake a randomized control trial looking at the same technology in the same patient population in Europe, but here the standard of care is conventional medical management, in other words, drugs, analgesia, physiotherapy, etc. Now, the reason for introducing this to you is to A, show you need to think about the comparator, but B, in this trial we intentionally collected only costs and outcomes. We did not do a formal cost effectiveness analysis, and the two plots below show you the EQ5D scores in the two populations, and you can see there's clearly evidence of better quality of life following intervention in the spinal cord stim group compared to conventional medical management. And if we move on, the issue we then have is that, well, how do we convert that data from the trials into cost effectiveness? And clearly in the constraints of time we're not going to be able to go through modelling in any great detail, but this is just to share with you the economic model we built to address this. So here was the decision tree element that then fed what we call a Markov model, and then as a result of using these mathematical models, and I'll skip over this slide for time, we can then end up with this analysis, and this was a publication where we used the model-based analysis to say, okay, what is the cost effectiveness of spinal cord stimulation? And again, here is a reproduction of the results. So you can see spinal cord stimulation is the intervention. There's two comparisons here. First of all, against conventional medical management. And you can see that in this case, the incremental cost-effectiveness ratio is about £5,000 per QALY. And actually, when we did the model-based analysis against reoperation, we actually found that, in fact, there was a positivizer here in about £6,000 per QALY. Now, this is all very interesting. And again, for time, I'm going to skip this slide. But, you know, you may say, in fact, this slide and the next slide for speed, and maybe the next one too. Does all of this matter? Well, this is really to say that these analyses were used by the company to put together their dossier to NICE back in 2008. And at that time, NICE asked the question, should we be funding spinal cord stimulation through the National Health Service budget? And the point I want to make is that if you've got good quality evidence, you can really make a difference here. So in this case, NICE was persuaded, because of those cost effectiveness, incremental effectiveness ratios you saw, much lower than the threshold of £20,000, they gave a positive recommendation for this technology. So I guess what I'm saying is that if you've got the right evidence package, you can put it in the economic setting, you can really make a difference here. So, to bring it all together, finally, let's just maybe bring out what I think are some of the key things that Oriana and I have tried to make. So hopefully, as you will have picked up, I mean, it is quite clearly we live in an increasingly difficult economic climate. High relevant clinical outcome data is therefore increasingly needed to get market access. But I hope we've also demonstrated to you that if you can assess economic value, it can really be a powerful lever to help get access to either pharmaceuticals or other health technologies such as the medical device I just showed you. But again, I think, as you will have picked up, in the constraints of time, we haven't been able to go into great technological detail, but the requirements for data and the sophistication of analyses are precise. And I think certainly one of the challenges that companies have is that there still remains little harmonization across countries. Different countries do have different requirements. But what I think is clear in the middle of all of this, and again, as hopefully as you've seen presented to you, is that when we design randomized control trials, we need to think about what are the HTA requirements. And at least two parts of that are thinking very, very carefully about the comparator. Making sure that we incorporate patient-relevant outcomes, particularly quality of life, and then last but not least, incorporate a parallel economic evaluation where we look at healthcare utilisation to inform the cost-effectiveness debate. And we would like to leave you with this quote. This is a favourite quote of both Oriana and I. So David Cutler, just for your information, David was the economic advisor to the Obama administration, and David's quote was, of course, we're not going to spend less, but figuring out how we get more value out of our healthcare spending is going to be the big issue for the future. So thank you for your attention, and we will now move on to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Oriana, Rod, and Everardo for that presentation. And now we are indeed moving into the Q&A portion of this webinar, and I've received some questions, so I'm going to start with those. And the first question we have here for the Q&A is, how is the information generated by HTA used in market price decisions and negotiations?
Okay. Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So if I talk from the UK perspective, people often refer to our system as being what we call a cost acceptor. So in other words, the company determines the price, and what the role of the HTA agency is then saying, given that price and given the QALY gain, is that cost effective at a threshold of £20,000 to £30,000? So in other words, we take the price that the manufacturer sets, and then on the basis of that, we determine is the comparative effectiveness sufficient to basically support that proposition. Now, in other sectors, I think particularly Australia comes to mind, they will do a two-stage process. They will first of all do the cost-effectiveness analysis, ask the question, is it cost-effective, but then do a second phase, and indeed this is being debated in UK, it's not in legislation yet, but then have a separate conversation around negotiating price, and often that price is made on what we call budget impact grounds. So it may be that the technology is cost effective, but because, for instance, the UK NHS is a large provider, they may still try and negotiate on what would be a lower price, even although the price currently being proposed by the company is acceptable for cost effectiveness. Other countries, I think France in particular, are much more, if you like, strong on the negotiation around price per se. So as I say, in UK, we're a price acceptor. Other countries may actually want to particularly focus on price, and I think the issue is the payer particularly interested in budget impact per se, and their price will be the key determinant, or are they interested in cost effectiveness, such as UK, and there they will be a price acceptor.
Great, thank you for that. And the second question is the HTA framework also applicable to non-randomized trials that eventually lead to drug approval, even if conditionally?
Okay, so I guess there's two bits to that. I will have a crack at it. Ariana might want to chime in a second. So will HTA agencies consider non-randomized evidence? Well, I think the answer to that is certainly yes. Certainly HTA agencies like the FDA or EMEA will have a hierarchy of evidence, and I think the first thing we'd want to say is well, why do we not have randomized trial evidence? But there are certain circumstances, for instance, that maybe the only evidence on the table is observational, and the obvious things that come to mind are very rare diseases, orphan diseases. We're doing even comparative studies, never mind randomized studies, are very difficult. The second part of that is something that we haven't talked quite so much about today, but the notion of what we might call conditional coverage is certainly out there. So what some countries do, and again, UK is probably not such a great exemplar of this, but certainly some European countries may say yes, based on what might be weaker evidence, then commission the company to collect data in the real world setting, as Oriana described it, and conditional on the success of what would be that observational evidence. They will come back to the table, they will reevaluate that evidence, and if that evidence has been positive and supports the original what was weaker case, they will agree to continue to fund the technology.
Great. And the third question we have here is, how can HTA handle situations for which surrogate endpoints are the primary endpoints in phase 3 trials leading to drug approval?
Actually, we have recently published a paper in Nature Drug Discovery Review on where we agreed on, or we proposed a framework on how to use surrogate outcomes evidence in HTA decision makings. And these frameworks basically propose to, first of all, collect the evidence supporting this surrogate to final endpoint relationship, and this evidence could include from observational studies and most importantly, or hopefully even more than one randomized controlled trials that would allow to establish the relationship between the surrogate endpoint and the final outcome of interest. And then based on the relationship that this relationship that has been derived from previous studies, link between the two endpoints will be used as an input in this cost-effectiveness model that we described during the webinar, is most of the time used to inform HTA decision making.
Great. Well, thank you very much for those answers. We have reached the end of the question and answer portion of this webinar. And you have further questions, please direct them to the email address showing on your screen. And please join us in thanking our speakers today, Dr. Everardo Saad, Oriano Chani, and Rod Taylor. Thank you all three.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And thank you everyone for participating in today's conference. You will be receiving a follow-up email from XTalks with access to the recorded archive of today's event. And a survey window will be popping up on your screen, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us improve our future webinars. And we hope that you found this conference informative. Have a great day, everyone.